Manhattan, New York, 2025. A biting wind whipped off the Hudson, cutting through Leo's threadbare jacket like a shard of ice. He huddled deeper into the shadowed alcove of a forgotten building on Central Park South, his stomach a gnawing pit of emptiness. His gaze was fixed on Le Fleur, a swanky French brasserie across the street, its golden glow spilling onto the pristine sidewalk like liquid wealth. The aroma of butter, freshly baked bread, and roasted meats wafted across the avenue, a cruel tease to his rumbling stomach. This was his usual spot. He has been forced onto the cruel streets of New York for more than 5 years now. He spent most of his teen years sleeping in the rough. He never wanted to live this way. He was an orphan and a ward of the state. Leo wasn't always this invisible. He was supposed to have a family. He was a kid, and those social workers had promised him they would get a family. But then there was nothing. Just emptiness. They had lied to him. Now, he spent his days navigating a world filled with broken promises and betrayals. And he hated rich people. He had seen it all. The warmth and laughter emanating from Le Fleur was a stark contrast to the cold reality that ate at him. Inside, well-dressed patrons indulged in gourmet delights, oblivious to the unseen eyes watching them from the periphery. Unsolved mystery cases like his own seemed to thrive in this city, hidden in plain sight amidst the towering skyscrapers and bustling crowds. His eyes scanned the scene, noting the designer handbags, the glint of expensive jewelry, the casual displays of effortless affluence. It was a different world, a world he was excluded from. A world that had, in a way, betrayed him. A memory flickered, a promised birthday party that never happened. Leo's throat tightened, and he suppressed the bitterness rising within him. This was his life now. He was invisible. He survived on scraps and the occasional act of kindness from strangers who saw a flicker of humanity behind his hardened exterior. He had been forced to grow up too fast for the thrilling story that was unfolding in his life. The journey of discovery he had been forced to undertake had shown him the dark side of humanity. He focused on the details of the cafe. A sleek car pulled up to the curb. A chauffeur opened the door, and a silver-haired man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, emerged, followed by a younger woman with striking beauty and an air of icy sophistication. They were the type of people who never looked twice at someone like him. Leo knew this dance. This was how the wealthy thrived, on the backs of people like him. He promised himself that one day he would find a way out of this existence. One day he wouldn't be invisible anymore. One day he would write his own ending to this thrilling story. He wouldn't be a victim of the streets forever. His jaw clenched, and he looked away, retreating further into the shadows. The warmth and aromas of Le Fleur were no longer tempting. They were fuel for a smoldering resentment that burned within him. He was an outsider looking in, forever separated by an invisible wall of wealth and privilege. Bernard Dubois, a titan of Wall Street, smoothed the lapel of his bespoke suit as the maitre d' led him and his wife, Serafina, to their usual table at Le Fleur. The restaurant, with its elegant decor and hushed atmosphere, was Bernard's sanctuary, a place where he could momentarily escape the pressures of his empire. Serafina, a vision in a crimson dress and a string of luminous pearls, offered a dazzling smile to the maitre d', but her eyes, Bernard noticed, held a certain coldness. As they settled into their plush velvet seats, Bernard felt a familiar unease settle over him. Serafina had been distant lately, her warmth replaced by a brittle politeness that set his teeth on edge. "Everything all right, darling?" Bernard asked, his voice a low rumble. Serafina tilted her head, the pearls catching the light. "Of course, Bernard. Why wouldn't it be?" She reached across the table, her manicured fingers briefly touching his hand before withdrawing. The touch felt cursory, practiced. The unsolved mystery of her recent behavior haunted him. Just then, Serafina's phone buzzed, and she excused herself to take the call. Bernard watched her move away, her lithe figure disappearing into the dimly lit recesses of the restaurant. He couldn't help overhearing snippets of her conversation, hushed whispers of trapped, unbearable, and finding a way out. His heart sank. "I can't do this anymore," Serafina hissed into the phone. She was leaning against a pillar in the back of the restaurant. "Be patient, darling." A low voice purred back on the other end of the line. "It's nearly time." "But it's getting harder," Serafina whined, her voice laced with desperation. "He's starting to suspect." "Don't worry," the voice reassured. "Just stick to the plan. Soon, we'll be free. Both of us." As Serafina returned, a forced smile plastered on her face. Bernard dismissed his concerns, attributing her behavior to stress. He was a busy man, and these domestic issues always seemed so insignificant compared to the deals worth millions. "Journey of discovery," he chided himself. Later, as their waiter served Bernard's favorite onion soup, Serafina busied herself with her purse. With a swift, almost imperceptible movement, she extracted a small vial from her handbag and tipped a few drops into Bernard's soup. Her expression remained serene, her eyes fixed on Bernard with a look he couldn't quite decipher. It was more or less complete, and she was very lucky Bernard never suspected a thing. "Bon appetit, darling," she purred, the weight of her pearls seeming to crush her. Leo watched Serafina's every move, the vial glinting like a venomous fang in the dim light of La Fleur. His stomach churned, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. His distrust of authority, ingrained from years on the streets, warred with a primal urge to act. Did he call the cops? Would they believe a street kid over a Wall Street tycoon and his beautiful wife? But something primal took over. He thought of his promises. He also thought of the men eating poisoned soup. He had to act. Forget the cops, he decided. This wasn't about justice. It was about saving a life. "Don't eat that." The words ripped through the hushed atmosphere of the brasserie like a thunderclap. All conversation ceased. Forks clattered against plates, and heads swiveled in his direction. Leo stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes bearing down on him. Bernard Dubois paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Serafina, however, went rigid, her carefully constructed mask of composure starting to crumble. She was now facing the unsolved mystery of what had just gone down. For a long, breathless moment, the restaurant stood still. All the hustle and bustle was quiet. Then the silence shattered, replaced by a cacophony of whispers and murmurs. Leo had broken the sacred code of La Fleur, the unspoken agreement to ignore the harsh realities that existed just beyond its gilded doors. He had broken the silence, but he had also just unleashed a journey of discovery that none of them could have ever anticipated. And now, all eyes were on him. The skinny kid in the worn-out jacket, the outsider who dared to shatter their illusion of peace. Serafina's reaction was immediate and fierce. She rose from her seat, her eyes blazing with a carefully crafted indignation. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is absurd. Security, get this. Vagrant out of here!" Her words echoed through the restaurant, turning the murmurs into a low roar of disapproval directed at Leo. "He's clearly delusional," she continued, turning her charm on the patrons, "probably just looking for a handout. Pay him no mind." The crowd, ever eager to side with wealth and privilege, seemed to accept her explanation. Leo stood his ground, defiant despite the hostile glares. He knew he had to convince one person, Bernard. "She put something in your soup, sir," he repeated, his voice shaking but firm. "I saw it. A vial, clear liquid." Bernard, however, was a study in contradictions. He was pale, visibly shaken, but his expression remained unreadable. He looked from Leo to Serafina, his eyes narrowed in thought. This was an unsolved mystery in front of him. "Serafina, is there any truth to this?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "Don't be ridiculous, darling," she replied, her voice regaining its composure. "The boy is clearly disturbed." As she spoke, Bernard slipped his phone from his pocket and discreetly sent a text. He needed someone he could trust, someone outside this gilded cage. Within moments he received a confirmation. His old friend and trusted lawyer, Mr. Harrison, would investigate this claim. Meanwhile, Mr. Harrison was already on the phone, digging into Leo's past. The records were a bleak tapestry of broken homes, neglect, and dead ends. Foster care failures, petty offenses driven by desperation, and a string of missed opportunities. Mr. Harrison didn't care about the man. He was a businessman, and he only cared about the result. This journey of discovery, as Mr. Harrison put it, was merely a task to be completed. Back at La Fleur, the tension remained thick, a thrilling story unfolding in real time. The crowd continued to buzz, fueled by curiosity and judgment. Bernard knew that he had to get to the truth, no matter the cost. The shadows were closing in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew was about to be shattered. The meal once anticipated was now ruined. The soup, sitting untouched, was a physical reminder. They returned to their penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the silence between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Bernard turned to Serafina, his voice low and dangerous. "I want the truth," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Did you put something in my soup?" Serafina met his gaze, her eyes wide and innocent. "Bernard, how can you even ask me that? You know I would never do anything to hurt you." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "The boy seemed so sure," Bernard said, his voice laced with doubt. "And you've been acting strangely lately." "Strange?" Serafina scoffed, a hint of anger flashing in her eyes. "I'm just tired, Bernard. This life, it's not as easy as it looks." "It's a constant struggle. What kind of struggling do you think it might be? Are you trying to paint yourself as a victim?" Bernard asked sharply, his eyes narrowing. "But you would never know, would you?" She spoke quietly. "You barely see me at all." "Well, I'm seeing you now," Bernard exclaimed, but he immediately felt a sense of guilt. He knew he hadn't been the best husband recently, and always tried to work. Their argument quickly dissipated as the realization came to Bernard. If he could be wrong here, it would mean he would be wrong about everything. Later, after Serafina retreated to her bedroom, Bernard made another call. This time, it was to an old contact, someone who specialized in discretion and uncovering secrets, a private investigator. Mr. Harrison had found what happened to Leo. It was now time for him to go into what had actually happened to him. "I need you to tail my wife," Bernard said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to know everything she does, everyone she sees. Leave no stone unturned." The unsolved mystery of Serafina was now consuming him. The private investigator would make it into his thrilling story. As he hung up the phone, a cold wave of paranoia washed over him. Could he really trust anyone? Was his entire life built on a foundation of lies? The journey of discovery he was embarking on was far more terrifying than anything he had ever faced in the world of high finance. He was seeing with his own eyes now. He knew there was a chance that his whole life would crumble to ash. 3 days later, Bernard received a thick envelope from the private investigator. He opened it with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside were photographs, grainy images captured in the shadows, but undeniably clear. One photo showed Serafina entering a seedy-looking establishment in a rundown neighborhood. Another showed her inside, engaged in a hushed conversation with a disreputable man. And finally, a close-up of a transaction taking place. Money exchanged for a small vial. The unsolved mystery was solved, but Bernard didn't feel relief. The thrilling story of his life had turned into a nightmare. The photographs were conclusive. Serafina had indeed sought out a black market chemist known for supplying untraceable poisons. The journey of discovery had led him to a place he never thought he'd be. He was in way too deep. There was no going back. Bernard's mind reeled. He felt a crushing sense of betrayal, a bitter taste of treachery coating his tongue. How could the woman he loved, the woman he had shared his life with, be capable of such a cold-blooded act? What had driven her to this? He looked out at the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Everything seemed surreal, disconnected. His world had tilted on its axis, revealing a dark underbelly he had never wanted to see. He wasn't going to stop until he knew everything. He'd been a fool, blind to the truth that had been right in front of him. Now, he had to act. He had to protect himself and find out why he'd been targeted. But he was so paranoid at this point, he barely knew what to do. Now fully dedicated to uncovering the full truth. Bernard was dedicated. He couldn't wait for anyone else to do the job. It was time for him to take charge. The game was on, and this was his new path. He wouldn't be able to think or act until he knew what had led him to this. Bernard, armed with the evidence, contacted the police. He wasn't interested in revenge. He needed justice, and he needed to understand why. Detectives' faces grim arrived at the penthouse. The air crackled with tension as they confronted Serafina. Initially, she maintained her composure, denying everything. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her voice laced with forced doubt. "Bernard is trying to frame me. He's obsessed, controlling." However, the detectives presented the photographs, laying them out like damning cards on a table. Serafina visibly panicked. Her carefully constructed facade began to crumble, revealing the raw desperation beneath. "Okay," she snapped, her voice trembling. "Yes, I went to that man, but it wasn't for poison. I needed something for myself." The detectives pressed harder. They knew she was lying. It didn't take too long before she broke. The story had completely ran out on her. Cornered, Serafina lashed out, revealing the resentment that had been festering for years. "I did it for years. I'm done with Bernard. I'm not going to live with that monster any longer," she cried, her voice rising in hysteria. "She took from me all these years. She made me give up on all my personal dreams so she could live comfortably and do her thing. She then launched a final desperate attempt to salvage her reputation. He was abusive, mentally, emotionally. He controlled every aspect of my life. He controlled every aspect of my life. I was trapped," she sobbed, trying to play the victim. "He deserves everything that's coming to him. He is always the victim. When is someone going to help?" The detectives, unmoved, exchanged glances. They'd heard it all before. As they cuffed Serafina, she continued to scream, her words echoing through the opulent apartment, a testament to the darkness that had been hidden beneath the surface. Journey of discovery, she thought. The silence in the penthouse was deafening. Serafina's accusations, monster, prisoner, abusive, echoed in Bernard's mind long after the police had taken her away. He stared at the city lights, once a symbol of his success, now a mocking reminder of his failures. Had he been so consumed by his ambition, so blinded by his own power, that he had failed to see the woman beside him was suffering? Had he turned their relationship into a gilded cage, unknowingly suffocating her dreams and desires? The thought was sickening. He thought about his career. All the business decisions that had been made over the years. He had been so focused on himself that he didn't know what anyone needed. It was time for a new perspective and a serious dose of reality. He was so ready to admit it. He realized that for years that she had been gone on this journey of discovery. He wondered what could have been if he had realized earlier. He saw how he hadn't cared for her. The realization was not easy. It had been a challenge for him. The memories played out like scenes from a movie. At one point she had said, "Please, can we go to Italy?" "I have always wanted to see the canals of Venice," Bernard had replied in due time. "You will see the canals of Venice." The truth was, Bernard had been too busy. Leo, he was also not sure. It seemed Leo was also trapped. The unsolved mystery of his own life was more confusing and more terrifying to him than anything he faced. He had to do something. Driven by a need to atone, Bernard decided to find the boy, the one person who had seen the truth when he couldn't, the one person who had saved his life. He knew it wouldn't erase his mistakes, but it was a start. It took him the better part of the day, working through contacts in the city's social services, but eventually, he found him. It was time for him to face everything. This was time for the thrill. This was time for the truth. 3 months had passed since the incident at La Fleur. The city had moved on as it always did, but for Leo and Bernard nothing would ever be the same. Leo was no longer sleeping on the streets. Thanks to the connections Bernard had made, he was now in a youth shelter, a safe haven from the harsh realities of his former life. He was attending classes, catching up on his education, and, surprisingly, discovering a passion for coding. He found a mentor who had also been on the streets. From there, he started learning coding to help him make video games, a way to leave the streets. Soon Leo had turned all of his attention to creating his future. He found other teens in a similar position and started teaching them coding. This small group grew and grew. Bernard, meanwhile, haunted the familiar streets of Manhattan, a ghost in his own life. The penthouse felt empty, sterile. The trappings of wealth offered no comfort. He often found himself drawn back to La Fleur, not to dine, but to stand across the street, gazing at the cafe, reliving that fateful day. It was a painful part of his journey of discovery. He was still searching to find the source to that unsolved mystery one afternoon. Driven by an impulse, he visited the shelter where Leo was staying. He didn't go inside, just left a sizable donation, wanting to contribute without intruding. That night, the director of the shelter called Bernard, letting him know that someone wants to talk to him 6 months later. Bernard's life was unrecognizable. He still lived in the penthouse, but the trappings of wealth no longer held the same appeal. He was now dedicating much of his time and resources to social causes. The thrilling story of Bernard's life had taken an unexpected turn. He had started volunteering at a women's prison. At first, it had been awkward, and he felt so guilty about his past. But soon he learned how to teach. It was one thing to have the means, but he needed something else to make it work. He taught courses on business, finance, and basic computer skills, giving these women a chance to rebuild their lives after their release. He wanted them to have options. One afternoon, after finishing a class, he realized Leo was now teaching everyone. He had the potential to help the women as well. He had to call. "Leo, it's Bernard Dubois," he began, his voice tentative. "I know it's been a while, but I was wondering if you could help teach the women. I'm sure you have a good and useful skill set that would turn out well." Leo was at first resistant, as always. "The things I have done and seen, you don't even know what I saw. You didn't know about the stuff." "I realize now I haven't," Bernard replied, "and I was hoping I could make up for it." A few days later, Leo was visiting the prison, teaching coding and showing people how to create video games. As Bernard watched Leo share his skills, he felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of redemption. This unlikely partnership was helping to heal old wounds and create new opportunities. Standing on the balcony of his penthouse that night, Bernard gazed at the vast expanse of the city. He looked for the street corner where he first saw Leo. He realized he had been wrong about so much. There was so much more to discover. He found some solace. The journey it had helped him to learn. What would be his ultimate fate? What journey would he be on next? This story, at its heart, offers powerful lessons about awareness, empathy, and the potential for change. Bernard's journey highlights the importance of self-reflection and recognizing our own biases and blind spots. Don't let success blind you to the needs and feelings of those around you. Take the time to truly see and listen. Similarly, Leo's story emphasizes the power of resilience and the importance of extending a hand to those in need. Even in the face of adversity, choosing compassion and acting on your moral compass can lead to unexpected and transformative outcomes. A practical application? If you find yourself in a position of power or privilege, actively seek out diverse perspectives and be willing to challenge your own assumptions. If you're struggling, remember that even small acts of kindness and integrity can create ripples of positive change. And most importantly, believe in your ability to evolve and learn from your mistakes. Redemption is not about erasing the past, but about using it as a catalyst for a more meaningful future. Embrace the journey and you too can open your eyes to a world of possibilities.